conceptual art. Today we're going to be talking about a movement called conceptual art that began in the same era with minimalism and land art and continues really even to today. Conceptual art, just the term, should clue us in that the artists involved with conceptual art are going to be more interested in the idea or the concept than the form or ideas of, let's say, beauty or the visual stimuli of an artwork. But don't be fooled, because all art that we've looked at has involved concept. Conceptual art prioritizes the idea above the form. The form of the artwork is a vehicle for the idea. So in the past, we might have seen artists who really prioritized the beauty of the painting, or making some kind of a shocking statement perhaps, or a very aesthetic statement. Here these artists are first of all interested in communicating an idea and then finding the right body, you might say, or form for that idea. This is one of the heralded works of conceptualism, coming from the very beginning, from 1965, with Joseph Kossuth's 1 and 3 hammers. And so as he exhibited this piece, we had on the left the photograph of a hammer. In the middle was a three-dimensional hammer, just the kind you would use every day, hanging in the center on the wall. And then the third part on the the right, was the verbal description or text description of a hammer. And so when we see conceptual art, sometimes when we first see work like this, it can seem very dry and perhaps very strange if we've grown up with the idea of art being, for most of us, art has been paintings or photographs. So to see this might seem kind of a strange puzzle. And it is, in a way, sort of a puzzle that does kind of tickle your brain in a different place than maybe traditional arts have. Here he's comparing these three versions of a hammer and asking us, which is the real hammer? Is any one of them more real than the other? Sometimes when we say real, we mean three-dimensional. But if we look back to someone like Plato, the Greek philosopher, he would say that the idea that exists in our mind is actually the most real, or even he would have said the ideal. And then that all three-dimensional versions, everything that we have here in the world, is sort of a bad Xerox of that idea. So Kossuth is playing on this concept of what is real, what is ideal, how do we communicate? And thinking of visual art as a language is one area that conceptual artists sometimes touch on, thinking about how do we communicate with one another, and noticing things like when we say that this thing is called a hammer, that's true in English, but in every other language it might be a very different word. And so even the very nature of language, which we tend to think of as defined and concrete, is actually really arbitrary at base. So kind of playfully considering that question of language. Another pretty witty artwork that would be a conceptual work is this one by John Baldessari, I Will Not Make Any More Boring Art, from 1971. And it's just that, right? The statement written over and over and over again. He began with traditional training and made paintings, and was actually coming about in the era that abstract expressionism was very big, in the late 50s and 60s, and so he kind of came about in that tradition, but grew tired of his own work, and so he began turning to new directions, and this was one of his attempts at sort of burning off the old and trying to make a start in a new direction. So kind of comical. An Kawara gives us this piece, July 8th, 1981. It is a painting on canvas. And here, too, there's, I guess you could say, a very dry humor about conceptual art. When we talked about abstract expressionism, we noted that many of the artists were sort of trying to make this existential statement, taking action in the moment, being in the moment of their era, but also in that moment of them in the studio, leaving their mark on the canvas. And here An Kawara gives us also a statement of timeliness, but here in this very sort of dry way, kind of playing on that idea of, well, you want timely, here it is. This is the actual date at which I'm making this painting, right? Now, conceptual art, of course, has some roots in the past. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. And you might have guessed that it has a link to someone like Marcel Duchamp or the Dada movement, where we see the concept of the artist becoming more important than the form. So when Duchamp brings these kinds of objects, his ready-mades, into the gallery, it's the idea that he as an artist has selected from all the different forms in the world, he has selected these, and then by bringing them into the context of the gallery, he's given us a new context, a recontextualization in which to consider these pieces, and they can take on different meanings by being in this new place, right? Sometimes I give the example of recontextualization, or how important context is, to students by saying, if I met any of you in a grocery store and came up to you and said, you need to write so many papers for me and take a test, you would, of course, think I was crazy. But because we're meeting in the context of a university, it seems totally appropriate and believable that you should write papers for me or take a test for me, right? So context definitely does matter. A urinal in your bathroom stall is one thing. A urinal in the gallery does become something different. Also roots for conceptual art in Surrealism. Many of you are probably familiar with Dali as a Surrealist artist, but also another one named René Magritte, a French artist who was involved in Surrealism. And he gives us a piece like this one on the left here. In French it says, "This is not a pipe." And the title of the image is actually called The Betrayal of Images. So we have a sense that there's some betrayal, some kind of a lie going on, and then we have the image, a fairly realistic portrayal of a pipe painted above the words, "This is not a pipe." And so here, Magritte is also questioning, well, but isn't this a pipe, or is it a representation of a pipe? Or should we say it's a painting of a pipe? Which is more real, the painting or our idea, or the pipe that you hold in your hand, or the written version of pipe here, P-I-P-E, right? And then years later, in the 60s, he did another version of it. And here we have almost sort of a quote of himself with "This is not a pipe" on the easel, with another version of a pipe up above. And this gives us a sense of, is this other pipe hovering here, maybe the idea in all of our minds, hovering above the portrayal of the pipe, and then, of course, the idea that both of these are actually in the same painting, the overall artwork. So sort of this dream within a dream, or language within language. So there's a conceptual root in Surrealism, going back to the 1920s. Kossuth again gives us 1 and 3 chairs, same idea as 1 and 3 hammers, just bringing home this contrast of photographic representation, three-dimensional object, and textual definition. Oops, sorry. Another good example and a route for conceptual art would be looking at post-painterly abstraction. So this was a kind of a transitional time right after abstract expressionism and heading toward pop art and minimalism, that we have someone like Robert Rauschenberg. And this piece that we're looking at here looks like a blank piece of paper, which is what it is. It originally had a drawing by Willem de Kooning, the famous abstract expressionist painter. And Rauschenberg was kind of a young, you might say young upstart in the art world in New York City, and he actually went to de Kooning and asked him for a drawing that he could erase. And Rauschenberg tells the story that de Kooning looked through folders and folders, portfolios of drawings, trying to find something that would be really difficult to erase, something that he'd used a variety of charcoal and pencil and oil pastel on that would be really tough to do. And so Rauschenberg took that drawing, and then over the next 2 or 3 weeks, going through tens of different erasers, erased de Kooning's work. Now, going back again to that idea of abstract expressionism as this existential statement of action, to erase de Kooning's action starts to question, well, if the point of abstract expressionism was to make such a statement, if you erase it or if you destroy it, does it invalidate that original statement, or does that meaning still hang in the air somewhere, or does it attach to the person who created it? It was also a way for Rauschenberg to both sort of honor de Kooning and also say, I've arrived, to take down this master artist who was very, very well known, and to say, okay, I'm going to replace his drawing with this kind of new open playing field, right? So another route for conceptual art. Not much to look at in terms of form, right? But that concept is what can be exciting. Baldessari, again, gives us the cremation project. Again, during that time when he was trying to kind of go in a new direction. He actually burned many of his paintings that he had made between 1953 and 1966. Burned them, and with the ashes made these little patties that look like, something like a seedy looking cookie to something like a cow patty. And he displayed them in this way and really was making fun of himself and his own efforts, perhaps failed efforts, but also trying again to kind of clean that slate and go in a different direction. And then lastly with minimalism, and this is really where the birth of conceptual art by that name came from. Sol LeWitt began working alongside of many of the minimalists that we talked about, Donald Judd and Dan Flavin, with these very simplified, rigid forms without much of the artist kind of fingerprint on them, right? You can't really tell who specifically made these. And he worked in repetition, which a lot of the minimalists like to do in that three-dimensional format. So these kind of simple cubes, although they are actually pretty exciting as forms, I think, as you see them in a gallery and you move around them, three-dimensionally, all of the linear components make different shapes as you move and you see through from block to block. If anyone's a fan of maybe architecture or kind of engineering, these types of works might really appeal to you in form. However, they also have a conceptual root. And you can see how he very methodically went from one form to another, doing these different iterations of how many different ways can I build up this simple form into a complex form, right? Excuse me. And LeWitt is actually one of the first artists to put into words the idea of what conceptual art is. And so he wrote very helpfully for us one article which he called Sentences on Conceptual Art, and another which was called Paragraphs on Conceptual Art. They're actually both very easy and kind of fun reads. He does have a sense of humor. But just to simplify here and take a few highlights, one of the things he says nice and clearly for us, he says conceptual art is to engage the mind rather than the eye or the emotions. He doesn't want the physicality of the artwork to interrupt the idea. And he encourages artists to find the best form for their idea. So by not letting the physicality of the work interrupt the idea, I think he's pointing out that many artists have gotten so involved with, well, how do I handle the paint, or what do I do with the bronze, casting? How do I do these different physical aspects of the work, that maybe they didn't build up the idea in and of itself well enough. So kind of just relying on it to be attractive without really thinking, am I actually conveying something interesting here in the idea? And then the second one, find the best form for the idea. So this is really important, and something that a lot of postmodern artists today are doing, is that rather than saying, well, I'm a painter, I'm always going to make paintings, or I'm a sculptor, I'm always going to make sculptures. Here LeWitt is saying, whatever your idea is, if it's better conveyed in paint, then you should make a painting. But if the idea comes better in sculpture, or if it comes across better in performance art, or better in installation, then do what you need to do to convey that idea, right? So not being branded by your own discipline, but by thinking of this idea needs to be made manifest in whatever specific material. From Sentences on Conceptual Art, he tells us, the artist's will is secondary to the process he initiates from idea to completion. His willfulness may only be ego. So he thinks that artists should have an idea and then follow that idea, follow that plan no matter what. That even the artist should submit their will to the plan and follow it through and not change directions. Thinking again that AbX is kind of the mainstay at this moment in time. This is very different. When the abstract expressionists are painting, it's all about their individual will and their emotions at that moment. And Sol LeWitt is much more distant. He's saying, don't give in to ego, stay on the course from idea to its completion. He says, number 10, ideas can be works of art. All ideas need not be made physical. Now that is a bombshell. To say that as a part of art, you can have an idea and not necessarily make anything is groundbreaking, right? Just get your mind around that for a second. So what would that mean? What would artists exactly do? Would they be much more like philosophers? Or possibly storytellers? Would you card catalog your ideas? It's a very radical notion that the idea is the artwork, whether or not it has a physical form. Later on, he says, the artist may not necessarily understand his own art. His perception is neither better nor worse than that of others. That too is pretty radical, that the artist is not the expert, that they, put these works together, but that other people's understanding of the work or perceptions of the work might be just as worthy or more so. He says the process is mechanical and should not be tampered with. It should run its course. And banal ideas cannot be rescued by beautiful execution. So if you paint the most incredible painting and yet it's a really bland idea, it's still bland artwork. He says you can't rescue it just by painting something beautiful. And I know not everyone might agree with this. Some of us would just like something that hangs nicely in our house, and that is a valid part of art. But I think it is interesting to think of on the professional level of art, the most kind of avant-garde or forward-thinking part of art, to think that a lot of artists, I believe, think that we've got a world full of beautiful things. We really need to be making things that communicate interesting ideas that can hopefully further the world or change the world. 33, he says, it is difficult to bungle a good idea. So you can't rescue a bad idea, but if you've got a good idea, it's kind of hard to wreck it. That's good to know. Just a couple more ideas from his paragraphs in Conceptual Art from 67. He makes the stance of conceptual versus perceptual. So conceptual is aimed at the mind, whereas perceptual art is really aimed at visual aesthetics or visual stimuli. And this can even be something that you might identify in yourself, that maybe you lean more toward conceptual art. You really like something to kind of trigger something new in your head, regardless of what it might look like. Versus others of you might really feel like, I really want something that stimulates my eye, that is really exciting or beautiful or intriguing to look at. He talks about the idea as a machine that makes the art. So let the idea, run its course, follow that idea through. Kind of artists need to get out of the way of that idea. So it's an interesting way of thinking of the idea as a machine. Eliminate subjectivity, arbitrary decisions, and capriciousness. And I think this is really important, that emotionally dry is not the same as boring. So he points out that we are conditioned by expressionists, and he might even throw in someone like the romanticists, that we are conditioned to expect an emotional kick. And I think that this has some validity here, whether or not conceptual art becomes our favorite or not. It is interesting to think about our culture still today, even though he's writing in the 60s. We really do like the dramatic highs and lows. We like, the roller coaster. And, it's interesting to question, can we get interested in something that is a little emotionally more stable, maybe even emotionally dry? That boring may not be the same as emotionally dry. So interesting things to consider. Now from here, Sol LeWitt ends up creating drawings like this. This doesn't look like a drawing. It looks like writing, which is what it is. He actually begins giving instructions for drawings. And part of the kind of fun and brilliance of this is that he will write down very specific ideas. So here you have, from the center of the square, draw a line halfway toward the upper right corner. From the end of this line, draw a line to the midpoint of the right side. So very specific kind of mathematical directions, sometimes even giving specific measurements. And from these directions, anyone can make a Sol LeWitt drawing, right? So you can own your own Sol LeWitt, whether you want to do it on paper or you want to paint it huge on the wall of your house. You don't actually have to go find a gallery, spend millions of dollars to buy a Sol LeWitt artwork. You can download the instructions and draw it yourself. So a really kind of beautiful idea, and here literally pointing toward the idea or the concept is what the artist has created here, but he's going to allow anyone in the world, anywhere, anytime, to create their own version, their own physical manifestation of his idea. And so sometimes you'll go to a gallery or a museum and see these kinds of works, these Sol LeWitt drawings, done by following these instructions. So it's a beautiful way of sort of fighting against art as a commodity, making it much more democratic, even free. And actually I have to say, at least in this case, I still find this very formally exciting. It's visually interesting to me at the same time as also being conceptual art. Right? has that both components, the form and the concept together. Another conceptual artist, Lawrence Weiner, has said, "Once you know about a work of mine, you own it. There's no way I can climb inside someone's head and remove it." And here again, too, pointing at that kind of critique of art as commodity, that he and many other conceptual artists wanted to make things that people would look at, be changed by, and then in that sense really own the work. You don't have to necessarily buy it because you've experienced it and been altered by it. So there's something beautiful and generous about those. Just a few other landmark conceptual works, especially from the original era. So Walter de Maria we might recognize as being related to minimalists and land artists. And here's another work of his called Earth Room from 1977, where he actually filled a gallery with black soil. So you can't actually enter into it. You're not allowed to march through it. You actually stand at this doorway and see this entire gallery space. And you know the gallery system, how it works. It's supposed to be a crisp, clean, absolutely, beautiful, pure white space, this contemplative space. And here he's kind of, in a way, sort of mucked it up with filling it with dirt. And you can smell the dirt. Even actually when you go and see it today, there's a room in New York that actually still holds this work. You can actually feel sort of the moisture and the smell of the dirt, even in the floor beneath it. And so it really changes the whole environment of that building. So kind of interesting, playful in one sense, but then on the other, you can look at it as a minimalist sculpture. I mean, even though it is literally dirt, it actually doesn't seem dirty. Do you know what I mean? The way it fills this room and makes you more aware of the open space up above it, so you have a sense of that positive and negative play going on. And then, of course, the high value contrast is also very graphically or visually interesting. Another Walter de Maria piece, Broken Kilometer from 1979. So here we see 3 rows in front of us, but there's also 2 more rows to the left. So a total of 5 rows, each with 100 polished brass rods. Each rod is 2 meters long and 5 centimeters in diameter. And the whole weight of this piece is nearly 19 tons. So it's a huge, hefty piece. And literally all of these, a total of 500 polished brass rods, if you laid them end to end, would go the length of a kilometer, right? So it's another way of envisioning this length that maybe we take for granted. I know here in the States we more often count in miles, unless we're runners perhaps. But thinking of this distance that you take for granted, that you might throw off the top of your head, oh, it's a mile away, or oh, it's 5 kilometers away. But actually seeing it laid out in this way within one room, within one visual field, is a really interesting change of concept about how you think about that distance. Similarly, he did a vertical earth kilometer. And so this is the same kind of polished brass rod, reportedly a full kilometer long. And what they did was drill into the ground and insert the brass rod and then bury it up to within about 2 inches of its depth. So when you go to see this piece, all you see is what we're seeing now. You see your own feet and then this tiny circle. But we know an idea that it actually goes 1 kilometer deep. Now this piece, I think, is funny in several different ways. One is that it's very monumental. If you think about the brass rods here being placed in the ground, you know that this is a large-scale, hefty work. So it's monumental in idea, but then actually when you would visit it, it would seem very minimal, very small and easy to overlook. And another playful thing about it is the concept of, do we trust him? I mean, that could be just, 5 inches deep, or it could be 5 feet deep. How do we know that it's truly 1 full kilometer? So how much do we trust the artist? That would be a good question. There's something playful about this conceptual work, not formally that provocative necessarily, but in the idea of it, very provocative. A couple of core issues just to sum up with conceptual art. Of course, all materials are possible, whatever will best serve the idea, whatever will be the best vehicle for the idea. No materials may be required, as Sol LeWitt told us that all ideas need not be made physical. In terms of skill and technique, it can vary widely. So some of these pieces might be quite easy to render, or like we said, not rendered at all, not made physical at all. But some of them are actually very difficult or very crafted, very skilled work. So it can vary quite widely. The artist may or may not physically create the work themselves or at all. And the artist is foremost responsible for the concept or the idea of the artwork. In terms of expression and the artist's intent, it's neither personal nor cultural, at least in the traditional sense. So they're not expressing, let's say, the religious or philosophical outlook of the culture, and most of them are not very personally engaged with, telling their own biography or their own life experiences. So in a certain sense, it's a bit removed. It tends to be more art that is about art, or art that is about language, like with Joseph Kossuth's 1 and 3 Hammers or 1 and 3 Chairs. Art that is focused on engaging the mind is the intent here. Visual and emotive engagement are secondary. And conceptual art is still a part of the practice today, so we can even look at this piece from the 90s by Damien Hirst called The Impossibility of Death in the Mind of the Living. And here he had an actual shark embalmed and displayed in this glass case, and you can see it from 2 different viewpoints here. And in this piece, again, like the artist, in terms of skill and technique, he has not done this personally. He has not caught the shark or embalmed it himself. He has not built even the case by himself. What he's done is come up with this idea that he thinks is very conceptually stimulating, very interesting and dynamic. And I think one of the interesting questions is, why is it in an art museum rather than at, a zoological center or, some other kind of biological museum? But being in the art context, we ask different questions. We come to an art gallery or museum to have an aesthetic experience, to consider things in a particular way. And so when you walk in and you see this animal, and you also consider the title often makes a big difference. We know that the artist is thinking about how we conceptualize death. So here, of course, the shark is one of the animals that we're most afraid of, right? And that also sort of symbolizes death, symbolizes fear and fear of mortality. And so here we are coming face to face with maybe our greatest fear, and its mouth is wide open at us, and yet it is also suspended, right? So it's our greatest fear suspended, which is somewhat how death is in our minds. We know it is, imminent. We know we can't avoid it forever. And yet, while we're alive, it is always sort of this abstract thing. We can't really imagine that the world goes on without us, right? One last conceptual piece, just more recent, coming from the 90s, by Felix Gonzalez Torres. And this piece, called Perfect Lovers, is simply 2 clocks hung side by side that are registering the same time. And I think this one is very, very sweet. It's just kind of a nice little poem in a sense about how in sync, you could say, we are with our most intimate of friends or lovers. So, challenges and critiques of conceptual art. Is conceptual art still a visual art? That's a good question. So, what is the appropriate balance between concept and form? When you no longer make an idea into a physical form, does that mean that we're leaving the realm of visual arts? And does that matter? Is it a problem? Secondly, is conceptual art alienating or elitist? So some of the ideas being communicated can be hard to reach. They can require you to know a lot about maybe art history, perhaps, or philosophy, perhaps. And so, is that too elitist? Is that not open enough for everyone? Is it a conflict of interest? So sometimes these artists are critiquing the art world while simultaneously contributing to it. Is that okay? So, critiquing that art is a commodity, but at the same time they might be displaying their work in a gallery or museum. So is that a conflict of interest? And then, of course, lastly, how do you sell an artwork that is not a single portable work, such as a traditional painting or sculpture? So how are conceptual artists making it in the world? We'll talk about that later on. Okay, here are some sources. The Art Story does have some information for you if you've been enjoying that website. Museum of Modern Art as well, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. Also on PBS, if you haven't checked out the Art 21 video series, please do. It is such a fantastic resource. They are short and very enjoyable videos. I think each artist section tends to be about 10 to 15 minutes, and they're beautifully produced little short segments. So there is an Art 21 video on John Baldessari, as well as another artist that we didn't see here named James Turrell, who does sort of more architectural large-scale works that you might enjoy. Actually, James Turrell also has a piece out at the Cheekwood Sculpture Trail. So if you are interested in going to Cheekwood Museum, if you're here in Nashville, keep an eye out for James Turrell's piece along their sculpture trail. That would be a beautiful way to see some art and maybe also write your paper. All right, guys.